Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Holly. Thank you, Annalie. Franklin, who preceded us, Tobias, and then Sean, who's offered a fantastic segue into what I am going to present. And somewhat counterintuitively, though, I am going to start, or rather, I am going to end where maybe I should have started with this presentation, Roadworks. I'm going to speak about space, which is the medium of the curator. I'm going to speak of 3 different spaces within which I have intervened. The first would be a biennial space, the second a museum space, and the third an urban space. And within that, I will try and follow the arc of development of what I will refer to as a wandering artwork, and with a roadwork. While I do that, I will also try to address some of the terms set by the conference in this panel in particular, that of traditional versus non-traditional space, for one, and then these other terms of the time or space of the exhibition. As you may remember, Tobias at first wondered, well, where shall my presentation fit, under the time of the exhibition or the space of the exhibition? And of course, the answer is that it can fit under both. So I will also address processional performance, since this is my topic, as that space that provides a time-space continuum that allows to link together a number of performance practices for which the African diaspora is known in part. In thinking about what may be traditional versus non-traditional spaces, to me, of course, a traditional space, to me as somebody operating from a Caribbean frame of cultural and historical consciousness, a traditional space of exhibition would be the yard or the camp or carnival, and not what we think of as traditional spaces of exhibition within a Western-centric art world, which would be the gallery space. So again, if we shift the focus of thinking that we are beginning to occupy our traditional space, and that they are only non-traditional in the eye of the beholder who might be Western, we're starting to tilt the axis, maybe. Because of course, those spaces that we think of as traditional from a Western-centric art world, which is that from which we continue to operate predominantly, are colonial spaces. Where I began by telling you that I am somewhat sadly going to end where I should have begun is that as a very traditionally trained historian, art historian, and a curator, I am faulty of articulating my thoughts as a counter to. And this is where, in a way, I am taking us back further away than from where Sean provided us a jumping off point to. So I am going to go back to this notion of the exhibitionary complex, which was developed by Tony Bennett in The Birth of the Museum. It, of course, brings us not just in a colonial space, but in a space of imperial expansion. Since Tony Bennett articulates this notion of the exhibitionary complex at the height, well, he articulates it now in the mid-'80s, but he refers back to the height of Victorian imperial expansion, and this moment when there's any numbers of techniques of display that are joining force to discipline bodies on the one hand and order objects, and that is really concurrent with the disciplining of other bodies that was taking place outside of the ground of, well, within the British colonial empire. Now, what is interesting is that the exhibitionary complex actually subsumes under itself both principles that became that upon which museum techniques of exhibitions were developed, but also always in tension with the international exhibition, the arc manifestation of which was, of course, the 1851 International Exhibition in London around the Crystal Palace. So there was this tension between the museum on the one hand as an enclosed space and the international exhibition, which is interesting to us because, of course, that is the model upon which is built the large-scale perennial exhibition, which is the forerunner to the biennial. So the exhibitionary complex really contains within itself both the museum and the international exhibition / biennial in a kind of a space of tension. I'm going to stop being all theoretical in a minute, but bear with me, because it really pertains to everything that we're discussing, and certainly to my main interest, which is not just in terms of replacing content, but really in thinking about context and structure, if not infrastructure. Because we can continue breaking mental walls in terms of the kinds of histories that we're sharing, but until we break the more physical walls within which we tend to enclose these forms, to me, we've only done but half the job. So to go back to the exhibitionary complex, it's all related to, the Foucauldian genealogical method. And there was this very interesting debate between Douglas Crimp, who was writing on museum ruins about the space of the museum as a space of confinement, to which, and of course it's all based on Foucault's The Castle Archipelago, the prison complex, and Bennett rebukes this assessment of the museum space and says instead, and I quote, what Douglas Crimp's suggests, that museums may be spaces of confinement, seems to suggest that works of art had been wandering through the streets like the sheep of fools in Foucault's Madness and Civilization. To which I respond, yes, they had. Artworks had been wandering through the streets like the sheep of fools in Europe pre-Enlightenment, and of course, sailing across the Middle Passage to the Americas and in many other cultural spaces in the world, not to not even mention African spaces with masquerading traditions. That's one, and of course the flurry of other such outdoor public mass public performance gatherings that take place in Southeast Asia, for instance. So. So I appropriate this idea of wandering artworks, which begins to speak also of a space of displacement, dispossession, and diaspora, but still seen through a Western-centric lens as something against which to position ourselves. And of course, I reappropriate this idea of wandering artworks. But for my own purposes. So now back again to this idea of traditional space, I began using another word which is very contentious because, of course, it may seem to bring us back to this dichotomic debate of nature versus culture. But let us replace the word traditional by natural. What are our natural spaces? And again, might that be the yard and the camp and carnival or the processional? The reason why I'm using the term natural is because, to me, in this arc of development from a wandering artwork to a road work, I had to, in a way, denaturalize the space within which the work I was interested in curating was taking place, in order to renaturalize it within a contemporary discourse. And so it's this kind of a mental gymnastics we, in a way, have to do to repossess and to be able to reappropriate and inject back into a naturalized art discourse. I am going to start to show you images and examples of the kind of more theoretical background of this presentation. And if we can go to the first, which is Spring in Gwangju, where, yes, thank you so much. And maybe we want to pause on this image. Oh, yeah, it's the last one. You go back this way. Well, yeah, well, let's pause here. Where do you go to denaturalize the space of Carnival or the space of the procession? Well, you go to Gwangju, South Korea. And you go to Gwangju, South Korea, because Okuen Wizor, ever the visionary, understands and articulates to you in these words that as someone who is from Nigeria, he knows what masquerade is, he understands where you're coming from, and he has a sense as to where you're going. I'm paraphrasing, but this is essentially how Okwe agreed to this proposal that I put out to him to organize what I was referring to at the time as a procession, which I now refer to as processional performance. If we need to give a cue to our performance colleagues that yes, it has everything to do with the field of performance, etc., etc. Let us maybe just run through the slideshow as I kind of speak on top of the images. But we're in 2008 in Gwangju, South Korea. Gwangju is a place that is both archetypal in the sense of the movement of development of large-scale perennial exhibitions, biennial specifically, in an Asian context, but also it is the place where in 1980 the Gwangju Democratic Uprising gave way to, well, the democratization of South Korea. And so to me, it began, my conversation with a space of the Caribbean became about establishing this relationship to events that had taken place a century earlier in the late 1880s, the Canboulay riots. So to me, I thought of Spring, which is the title of this processional performance, as a space where to put into practice what my friend and colleague phrases such, which is, and Chris Thompson, how to install art as a Caribbeanist. It is not just about installing Caribbean art. Or the way in which I translate it is to think curatorially from a frame of Caribbean historical and cultural consciousness. As it so happens, Spring in Gwangju brought together predominantly Caribbean artists, and these included Mario Benjamin, and we saw here, where that was the DJ Jin Won Lee, so a Korean artist. This is Map Office. They're French, live in Hong Kong. They were looking at funeral processional traditions from southern China. These are the remnants of their wagons. We're back at the top, and I think as the slideshow loop, we should see, that's a video that we won't stream. We will see the work of, well, that's another view of the processional going around. This, by the way, was referred to as the Savannah by my assistant curator, who was Sam from the Kalalu Company. This is the site of the look on the place, the face of the people. This is Jabas Lopez from Brazil. There was Marlon Griffiths from Trinidad. What I'm trying to say in short is that yes, there were a lot of works of artists of the Caribbean, because after all, thinking curatorially from a place of consciousness that is of the Caribbean is to serve the work of Caribbean artists, but it was not a carnival. It was a processional performance, which was this time-space continuum within which to curate a performance that addresses not the few, but the many, and that brings together temporal and spatial dimensions at once. And of course, it is not by accident that my first such experiment took place in a biennial space. And in fact, most of my curatorial work took place in biennial spaces. Tobias, how am I doing? Because I feel I'm running a bit, but is it good that I'm running? Or
yes, keep running.
Okay, I keep running. Okay, so then we're going to go to my next example, which is, and I'm still, and we might pause for a minute. I'm still, trying to show you this arc of development between still a kind of a Western-centric frame of reference, if in a kind of a countering position, which is that of the wandering artwork. I'm also showing you this process of renaturalization or reterritorialization of what to me was my traditional space, or what I wanted to be my traditional space, which is that of the processional performance. But all the same, I end up in a museum. And where could that museum be, and what could that museum be? Where London, back at the heart of empire, and where at the Tate Modern. And maybe we can keep going through the slides. And why? Well, there's always, people involved. I mentioned the role of Okui as concerned, and Wizor as concerned the Gwangju Biennale. In this case, it was the role of Catherine Wood, who, under the head of the performance department in international art at Tate Modern. Catherine had wide enough, or has wide enough, a frame of reference in terms of what qualifies as contemporary visual art performance as a Londoner to think of the Notting Hill Carnival. So she was interested in Carnival, but she also understood the Turban Hall as a processional space. It's very interesting to me because the Turban Hall, by dint of its monumentality, reminded me immediately of the Sambodromo in Rio. And in many ways, spatially, it is the equivalent of Rio de Janeiro's Carnival Stadium, only it is, let's pause here, only it is covered. It is further interesting in this process of renaturalizing a traditional space of exhibition formation, that of the processional performance, in the Turban Hall, when you know that those who refurbished the space, who redesigned it, are Herzog and de Meuron, Swiss, Basel-based, with a huge relationship to Carnival. And so I'm not trying to suggest that, like me, they had the Sambodromo in mind when they redesigned the Turban Hall, but there's a kind of inter-spatial discourse that you can begin to form when your frames of references are other. And how you can kind of link them and kind of circulate them, together. From the Turban Hall to having knowledge of Herzog and de Meuron's relationship to Carnival by way of Basel, to thinking spatially of the Turban Hall as a covered Sambodromo. And this is the work of Marlon Griffiths, with whom I've worked a lot. There's a lot to be said about the ropes and the way in which it was a way to, in a way, bring the gaze from one end of the Turban Hall to the other end, and enhance the processional dimension of the space in many different areas. I see Tobias looking at his watch, so I'm going to keep. Yeah, I'm good. Okay, I'm going to keep going. But let me just quickly go through my notes to make sure that I'm telling you everything that I wanted to tell you, from the biennial, yet back again to a museum space in London at the Turban Hall, still with wandering artworks. And also to think that at Tate internally, and maybe Tanya, you know more about this than I do, the Turban Hall is referred to as the street. And apparently, yes?
It is.
Yes.
Also because it has the conditions.
Correct.
Closest to the street in terms of climate, like no climate.
Exactly. Yes. But I'm going to keep moving. And I'm going to end where, as I said, I should have started. And so let's go to the third tab, which is going to be side by side. Let us go, because here we're seeing a lovely lady out of a food truck. Oh, that's kind of me. Yeah, we can move on, although this is an interesting context. Let's keep going. This is also, we can keep going, although that's a small video we could have looked at. Let's pause here. Yes. So here we are in Miami Beach, Mid Beach specifically, under the auspices of Faena Art, an organization started by an Argentinian couple, interested, Jimena Caminos and Alan Faena, to name them, interested in precisely, well, Miami as that space of relationship between Latin America and the Caribbean, and thinking of one of the opening events for their otherwise very wall-bound space, the Faena Forum, as a processional performance. So in a way, my first curation of such projects, surprisingly, quite some 8 years later, in the US where I've been based, but where in many ways my ideas have had less of an impact than they have had elsewhere in the world, such as in Gwangju or in Europe. But in any case, 2016, last year, we're leaving the biennial space or the museum space, and we're really back on the road. And it's very important to bias. It's really not so much the street as it is the road. The road that, of course, has a much greater import in thinking of, as a diasporic metaphor. And, of course, the road, because we owe to Christopher Cozier, who we are quoting for the second time after Franklin did, because of his pioneering work as a critic of the Caribbean, able to articulate frames of art historical reference to the work artists and curators do. And so I haven't had a chance to catch up with Chris yet, in part because I kind of needed to go through this before I could engage with him. Because I think that, Chris, you were writing about roadworks back in when? In like the early 90s? Yes? Yes? And you were, and it's kind of funny to speak for you because I'm here, but we'll talk together later, or you come up here. But Chris coined this term of roadworks and applied it to the work of the great massman Peter Minshall. And I understand that Abigail Hadid was also involved later on in the magazine Roadworks, etc., etc. But quite so many years later, I find it a really handsome and wholesome word around which to think of that practice of processional performance under global conditions of dispossession and diaspora, where I want to think of our exhibitionary structures as that which we can bring on the road with us. In a way, I am putting myself under conditions of impending precariousness, and my work and the work of the artists with my, I work very much reflects that. Is it time for me to summarize and end, maybe? Yes? So let us go through the slideshow. You will see the works of various artists such as Los Carpinteros with their Retro Conga, which they first premiered in Havana, the Havana Biennial in 2014. Very special moment. Fidel Castro had just passed. And there they were with their reversed conga, leaving it clear to everyone what they had been saying all along before the passing of El Comandante. At the end of the perspective, we see the work of Puerto Rican-based artist Carlos Betancourt with a giant piñata that made all kinds of things. It's, spewed, confettis and smoked, and there was a pelican on top. It is in a way the most carnivalesque of all projects I ever did, quite some 8 years later after trying to steer clear of it. But now to summarize maybe usefully and trying to put forth new terms, in addition to that of word work, which I'm happily borrowing from Chris and the context of Mass and the Trinidad Carnival, to think of the processional performance, in addition to that space that can put us in this place of, if not actual, impending dispossession and diaspora, which is where we as people of the Caribbean belong, and which is the place from which we have a lot to say to the world that is increasingly coming under these conditions. More strictly curatorially and within an exhibitionary frame is to think of processional performance as an heterochronotopia, by which I mean an already othered time-space continuum. Heterochronotopia brings together the idea of the heterotopia, which is Foucault again, of other spaces, but also the idea of the chronotope, which brings us back to Bakhtin and the Carnival. So to think of a space that can bring together a time-space continuum for performance, but also much more broadly, but just a place where to begin that practice of thinking curatorially as I said, from a Caribbean space of consciousness, and thinking processional performance as the diasporic articulation of the curatorial. Thank you so much.